Afternoon, I'm with Hugh Costello at home in his back garden. Thank you very much for having me, Hugh.
No problem.
And so I want to talk today about your career as a writer, particularly in radio drama. I suppose I'll start by saying I've noticed that you've written in a sort of quite a wide number of formats, but how did you get into the radio drama?
Well, I'm originally a journalist, and still a journalist, and was happy enough doing that actually when I first started writing. Then I decided that actually there were interesting stories to be told that didn't quite fit the messiness of the real world, and that so I decided to start writing drama. Worked quite a lot in TV, wrote for things like Holby City and other returning shows. Written some films as well, but actually I have to say that what I love about radio, and the reason that I mainly write for radio, is there's a tremendous amount of freedom. It's a real writer's medium. You don't have the same commercial pressures that you do with TV and film. Also, those industries are very much run by, producers in the case of television and directors in the case of film. And a lot of the time, the stories you're telling are, they are yours, but they're very heavily sort of influenced by the demands of others. And radio is a wonderfully free medium to write in. It also lends itself. There's very little single drama left. There's almost none on television, really. I don't think there's anything now. And I love single dramas. As an audience person, more even than a writer, I'm actually not a fan of box sets, 60 episodes or something. I get bored. I don't care enough about Frank Underwood to watch 5 series of
that's lucky then, isn't it?
of House of Cards.
Well,
I know I'm an exception, but I love a story. Probably my ideal is a great movie where you go to the cinema, sit in the dark for 2.5 hours.
But it's
over.
But it's 45 minutes. Like the afternoon play, a good length for you.
Yeah, sometimes it's frustratingly short. There are times when I wish I had more, and some you do get a bit longer with some. I've written some Saturday afternoon ones where you get 60 or even 75 minutes.
Was there a particular work or single drama that inspired you to get writing?
I probably growing up was theatre actually. Growing up in Ireland, there's a fantastic tradition of stage drama in Ireland. I did try writing for the stage, but I wasn't very good at it. I think it's probably the hardest thing to write is a good stage play, I would say, of all the genres of writing.
Why is that?
Well, I think it's the issue of exposition that I found I wasn't very good at avoiding exposition, because one of the things you do have to do in a stage drama is explain what's going on. You don't have close-ups, panning shots, special effects, anything like that you would have in TV or radio or film. And I found I never seemed to be quite able to balance character with exposition, which I think. But I would say growing up, I watched a lot of drama and was quite influenced by quite political sort of drama, Bertolt Brecht and stuff like that. Mother Courage, I remember being blown away by a production of that. Not because I was a Marxist particularly, just because I loved how it seemed to really relate to the real world.
Right.
I also liked dramatists like Beckett, all of whose stage plays work wonderfully well on the radio. They are basically radio plays, Beckett's dramas, in my opinion, in that they're very static. Nobody really moves. You will have characters who spend their whole lives in a bin or buried up to their waist in sand.
But coming back to this issue of exposition, do you find, I find as someone who is tipping my toes into the radio drama world, that can cause problems in itself, there is that famous parody, isn't it? The gun that I have in my right hand is loaded, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
And
yeah.
There are pitfalls in radio too with exposition, are there not?
Yes, there are. You learn how to avoid them, and the thing you can do in radio is you can mix what I often do is I combine monologue with dialogue, and so you can set up or close the scene through the narration of the central character, breaking out of the need for people to explain things to each other, but that character, a sort of internal monologue, figuring things out for themselves, can be a very elegant way around that. So that's what I do a lot of the time. So radio does offer you that possibility, and if you listen, actually, a lot of the best radio dramas use that device. They really do, particularly things that are adapted, use that device a lot.
So, I mean, we touched on it earlier. Many of your plays have sort of tackle political issues, so important political themes, and some of them are very current. So, the play that you had most recently on for the afternoon drama was Forward Presence, which is about the situation with NATO in Estonia currently, and one of the references it makes is to the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury, which strikes me as something that was well, as I listened to it, was only 2 months or 3 months old. So do you think that the fast turnaround of radio sort of lends itself to political pieces?
Hugely, because the big advantage you have with radio is the lead-in time in terms of setting up a production is very short, because the production logistics of radio are extremely simple. So it's really about how quickly you can write it. That's the only concern. I mean, you also have to persuade them to commission it at short notice, and they don't do many of those. So, I'm sort of on a very short list of people who can go in to Radio 4 and say, I really want to do a play about UK-Russian relations revolving around NATO. But I said to them I wanted to go out, before or around the time the World Cup starts, because I thought there might be a heightened sense of UK-Russian relations with the World Cup being in Russia. There was even talk at one point, that first of all the UK wasn't going to send any ministers or royalty, which they didn't. There was even a slight sense they might end up boycotting it. I think, I don't think that was ever very real. But I thought, it's the perfect opportunity. Early June will be the perfect time to do this, just as the World Cup's starting.
What do you make of the apparent PR success of the World Cup?
Didn't surprise me at all. I had a strong feeling that they would pull that off. I mean, when they had the Winter Olympics in Sochi a few years ago, they spent billions making sure that everything worked smoothly, that all the people who mattered had great hotel rooms and easy transport and very, very secure. And I was 100% certain that Putin would not allow anything to go wrong with this World Cup. I wasn't remotely surprised that everyone's come away going, my God, those Russians are really good. because we do have, I absolutely deplore Putin and his activities, beyond his own borders in terms of catching up with his enemies and things. I mean, he's a dangerous man. But we do have an extremely negative and rather cliched view of the Russians at the moment that reminds me, you won't remember the Cold War, you probably weren't even born when the Cold War was
No,
but when I was growing up, I wasn't even sure if Russians would look like me. That's how much they were depicted as the other, as this sort of weird, difficult. So to me, I think it's good that people have seen that actually Russians are just people, and
I mean, that's something you perhaps delve into in the play. This amazing moment where a hostage is forced to give the Russian side of it, and then the mother of the hostage finds herself quite susceptible to this propaganda, and which throws up this question: do we have a completely unbiased view of Russia's relationships with the West? And I mean, for me, that really struck a chord. Can we be completely sure when we are, have these incidents presented to us, like the Skripal poisoning, like Litvinenko, that we're really seeing all sides of the picture?
Well, we can't be sure of that. Funnily enough, Litvinenko lived about 200 yards from here at the time of his death. So you're in Litvinenko territory.
Did you know
him? I didn't know him personally, but I saw him around because he was actually keeping an eye on an exiled Chechen warlord who lives just down there.
Brilliant.
He lived across the road from him, not coincidentally. He was a security minder, basically. And that man's grandson went to school with my daughter, who's there. So we used to see him around Litvinenko. He looked like an ex-KGB agent.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it wasn't remotely surprising.
You don't shirk these political issues. I also had a very enjoyable listen to The Crossing, which was for a few years back, which proved to be quite a prescient piece about Brexit and the Irish border. Do you find it daunting at all to write about the future of politics?
On the contrary, that was I wrote that play just after David Cameron had announced that there would be a referendum, and I immediately thought this is kind of fascinating because nobody, because I'm Irish originally, I look at things through both British and Irish perspectives, and I kind of realised that nobody here was even thinking about what was going to happen with Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement and the border if Brexit went through. So the only difficult thing about that play was persuading other people that it was even remotely possible that Brexit would happen, and the earliest people that I had conversations with about that drama said, well, it's a great idea, but it's not going to happen. And I said, well, I'm not so sure. I think there's a lot of people in this country are going to vote for Brexit. I won't pretend that I thought they would win. At that time, I thought it would be 55-45 Remain. But I wasn't surprised that when Nigel Farage turned it into an immigration-centred campaign, that he managed to swing a lot of people around. So, far from finding it daunting, I tend to look at these sort of counterfactual. I'm a big history buff. I used to write for a history magazine for years, and I love looking back and trying to get into the minds of people. Say Germany in the late 20s before Hitler, you kind of think, well, did anyone really see it coming? Was it a surprise? I love to imagine things like that, and so a logical extension of that is to imagine now, is to look in your crystal ball maybe 5 or 10 years ahead and think, because if you'd gone back a few years, you'd never have believed that Donald Trump would be president, and Macron, who didn't even stand for either of the main parties in France, had a landslide victory. Brexit, all those things would have seemed ludicrous to you a few years ago, and now they're the new normal. So, just to get back to your original question about radio, the short lead-in times are great. The cheapness of producing is great as well. And the other advantage with it is that I think because the audience for a radio play have to dress the drama themselves in terms of designing. So you're listening to a scene and it's in a bar in a radio drama. You form a picture in your mind, like you do if you're reading a novel, of what that bar looks like. And that's your version of that is exclusive to you, just as mine is to me. And I think it's in some ways because it's not very realistic radio drama. You have the advantage that you can tell difficult stories to people and you can get away with it a bit more, I think.
I mean, that leads me on to a question I had about sort of soundscapes and your visualization of scenes. There's another play that you wrote called Promises, where you have a lovely sound effect, I thought, of the chopping of vegetables. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
And that brought me straight into the kitchen, even sort of the forcefulness of the way they were being chopped. It really, I thought it was a wonderful piece of sound effects. So what do you think creates a good soundscape or a good environmental?
I think the most important thing, I run a workshop about writing radio drama, and the thing I always say to people is, when you're writing a scene, don't ask yourself so much what will the listener hear, what are the characters hearing in the scene? Because the world is almost never silent. Right? So pick any moment in your day, other than when you're asleep in bed, and even then, in fact, when you're lying in bed, there's still a weird soundscape going on. I said there's always noise, and you have to try to hear that when you're writing a scene. So, for example, something like chopping vegetables, this way that it's done can tell you quite a lot about the state of affairs between the two people having the conversation.
Yeah.
So, the actors themselves don't actually do that, but I was joking with Nick Dunning, who played that character in Promises. He was saying to me at one point, I can imagine I'm really going at those carrots now, with lethal intent, because his marriage is tense and difficult, and at that moment, and so you can, but the main thing is really to try to make sure that you're true to what the characters, what their sensory experience is. If there's a fire burning, so like on the moors recently or something, you have to imagine how that would affect your daily behaviour if you were living with this stench of smoke. It's important because these things do affect us as people. What we can see, what we can hear, what we can smell, what we can touch.
And yet distilling that down to one thing is, I suppose, quite tricky, because what is the most prominent thing? You're hit by a number of sounds.
Yeah, because you can't have I mean, you can't really have. You can maybe have 2, but any more than that. I mean, it kind of depends who you're working with, because some drama directors are almost like frustrated sound designers, and they love all that stuff, and they'll spend hours afterwards adding effects, often rather than doing it at the time. And then a lot of other drama directors really don't care. They don't actually think that stuff matters at all. And you just keep it down to an absolute bare minimum, just as you would find some theatre directors like a minimalist set, and others want to dress it heavily. And and I just think all that matters is you locate the audience in the world of the characters, so that they can really feel, what is that like? I mean, I suppose the Archers, you've always got a cow mooing somewhere in the background. It's that kind of thing. You have to just make people feel like they're there.
I mean, would you ever sort of think of the approach of recording outside the studio, or would that kind of be an interesting?
My new drama that I was telling you about a minute ago about the man looking for his son will be recording entirely on location.
Fantastic.
There might be a small amount of narration done in a studio at the end, but all the scenes between actors will be recorded. I've done a few things like that. It adds a lot. I mean, it can take a lot more time, is the only problem, because I wrote a play a couple of years ago set in Palestine in 1947, and we recorded it at BBC Bristol, and there was a particular scene involving a murder which took place out the field, and every time we were recording that scene, a bus would go up White Ladies Road, and we'd have to stop and wait for the bus to go by, or a plane would fly over. And that's obviously, with historical drama, that's very difficult. If the drama's contemporary and just set now, then those ambient sounds shouldn't really matter. And there's an argument for just getting. I mean, with the modern technology of light mics and fantastic levels that it used to be, if you got your levels wrong, you couldn't listen to it. But now it's so much better that you really should be able to record everything moving around really now.
I wanted to know, when you're sort of creating your work, it seems to me that some people, work from characters, some people work from a setting. Do you work from themes mostly, do you think, or a thematic question?
Yes, I probably do. It's very true that some writers are extremely character fixated, and they have this character going around their head for years, and then they eventually find a story that they fit into. And I'm probably the opposite, in that I want to write about UK-Russian relations, and what if NATO and the Russians had a falling out on the Estonian border, and then I think, what's the best way to tell this story for the medium I want to tell it for, and create characters. So I'm not really one of those writers who sort of turns into the character they're writing, or writes endless notes about how their minds work and stuff like that. I'm not particularly bothered about that, if I'm really honest with you.
Are you less attached, do you think, perhaps, to some of your characters?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, I wrote a film a few years ago called Bernard and Doris, which was about 2 real people, both of whom had died, which gave me a lot of freedom to sort of reinterpret this strange story of their friendship. And obviously that was a sort of much bigger, longer project, and I went to the trouble of meeting people who knew both of them, and talking to them. And I actually did really get into the 2 of them. I really did psychoanalyze those 2 characters. Partly also because it was a movie and it had quite famous actors in it, and they wanted to sit with me and, and say, so tell me more about Bernard and tell me more about Doris. So I had to have something to say to them, that helped them to get further deeper into the characters. Because actors are actually more interested in that, I think, than anybody else. Probably.
So when you came across the story of Doris Duke, did you immediately think this is a film, or?
Yes. Well, actually, I first came across the story of Bernard Lafferty.
Okay.
The origin of that project was I read about his death in a newspaper, and I remember I cut out the article. It was that long ago when you still cut out articles, and just thought this is a really interesting character, because people have these sort of ideas of Irish migrants, like they're either sort of rough, talking, hard drinking builders, or they're sort of IT people, or something like that, or they're U2, And here was this guy who'd gone to America, and he was orphaned. He was unhappily gay, he was an alcoholic, couldn't really read or write, and he ended up forming this extraordinary close bond with this woman who was quite literally the most symmetrically opposite person on the planet to him.
Yes.
And I was thinking, how on earth did that happen? When I read this article, that was the first thing. And I was working with a production company at the time, film production company, on something else. And I was out with the woman there that I was working with one evening, and she said, "What else have you got? You know, have you got any ideas?" And I told her the story, and she said, "Oh, that's a movie, absolutely." And it took quite a few years to make that happen, but it did eventually come to pass.
I wanted to talk about something I saw in a couple of plays. So I've been, as you might have guessed, I've been sort of going back through a lot of your radio drama and the afternoon plays, and thinking about these characters who often sort of get a sort of nasty comeuppance, and they come to face the consequences of their own decisions. Thinking about the guy in the forgetting curve, I think it's Greg, is it? And and Sarah, the middle class mum in Promises, who tries to step in and it all goes horribly wrong with this fundraiser. So do you think it's nice to see, or do you enjoy doing that to your protagonist? You know, making them do something well intentioned which backfires.
I love doing that to them. Yeah. I mean, to be honest with you, if I had to find one thing to define what I write about, it's the fine line between virtue and narcissism, because it's something that's always fascinated me in life. People trying to do a good thing and making a mess of it. I mean, another one, I don't know if you came across a play of mine called Belarus.
I haven't listened to it yet.
And it's about a young, very idealistic Catholic priest in London, English priest, and he's approached by one of his parishioners, who's a young Belarusian woman, whose father is being held prisoner in Belarus by Lukashenko, who's the dictator of that country still now. And they're Catholic family, and she says, you know, I've been trying to get the church to speak out and nobody will, and he gets all sort of agitated and empowered by this, and he goes to great lengths to make a big noise about this imprisoned dissident. And his bishop is saying, well, our experience is you do these things quietly behind the scenes, and he's saying, well, I'm sick and tired of quietly behind the scenes. Nothing ever changes. And he oversteps the mark in his attempt to help the man, and word comes through that this imprisoned man has died of a heart attack. I'm making air quotes as I tell it. Because basically he has raised the ante to such an extent that this person has become a problem for the Belarusian authorities, and they've finished him off. And so here is this man who made a campaign out of it. It's gone wrong. The young woman has lost her father. Nothing's changed. His own career has taken a step back as well, as he was on a fast track. And all because he thought he could make a difference, and he ends up having to question for himself, well, what was that actually all about? Was it really about this dissident man, or was it actually about me
and his own vanity,
you know, pumping up my own ego and really feeling it? And a lot of things I've done have an element of that. Like you say, Promises is another good example where, I mean, they tried to, it's almost like they're saving their marriage by getting involved jointly in this auction of promises for the sick child, and you know, and of course that ends up the unforeseen, unintended consequences, and end up completely destroying them. I
also noticed sort of this tendency sometimes towards an open ending. Do you think good radio drama with an interesting question at its heart ends best in a sort of open manner?
I personally love endings like that, obviously, or I wouldn't do it. Luckily, the man who's currently the commissioning editor of drama, who's leaving, unfortunately, but he likes them too. I can imagine somebody else saying enough of those endings. There was one in particular about a paedophile priest trying to jump off a car ferry and begging the person who's with him to let him quietly slip over the side into the sea. And it ends with the other man narrating, will I let him go, will I hold him back? And we never find out. And 3 different people rang me up after listening to that, people I know.
Really?
And said, what happened? Did he jump? Did he let him jump? I said, I don't know.
That's not the point.
That's up to you. You know, when I wrote the end, that was the end. And I love them. I did it again in Forward Presence, actually.
Yes. I want to know the truth.
You know, I just I think it's quite realistic. I think the world is messy, and there are very few neat endings in real life. And I think it suits some things better than others. I wouldn't do it in everything. Sometimes a bit of nice, neat, dramatic closure is quite satisfying, and that's good. And I'm happy to do that. But yeah, I do enjoy it. And I think it can actually help the thing. It can give it a longer life in some ways, because I think people listen to it and then actually think about it for longer if they haven't been given the neat ending.
That makes sense to me. Do you always work with the same sort of team with producers and directors, or?
No, I've probably worked with 5 or 6 different directors. I mean, the producer and the director is the same person in radio, which is one of the reasons I love radio, because television, there's just so many people, and you never know who they all are at meetings and things, and 15 script editors and whatever. And with radio drama, you have to pitch as a team. Even someone like me who's done lots of them, when you go to them with a drama idea, it needs to be with a producer already, because that's how they commission it. They don't ever commission a writer in isolation from a producer. So when you're starting out, you have to find those people. And I mean, I did the thing of listening, to something I liked and writing down the name of that person and finding their email address or their phone number or something, and just saying to them, I've got this idea, I think it'd make a great radio drama, it might be the kind of thing you'd like. Do you want to read it? But I mean, that would be, do you want to read a page? Not the whole thing, because nobody wants to read the whole thing at that stage. Sure. That's a lesson people need to learn.
So would you say, in terms of your backlog of ideas, is it all lots of one pages, or do you have lots of spec scripts on you, or what's going to...
No, I've written...
In terms of your portfolio?
I've written very few spec scripts, because I think you have to develop the skill. I mean, this is probably because I'm a journalist, first and foremost. I was a journalist for 10 years or more before I ever wrote a word of drama. You have to develop the skill of putting down your idea and somehow conveying why it's a good idea and why it suits the medium that you're writing it for, in as few words as you possibly can. It's actually a great exercise, that. It's a really good thing to do, because you actually you can show yourself what the strengths and weaknesses of this idea are by trying to say. So what's a side of A4 is about 350, 400 words, something like that. If you can tell a story in that length, and it really feels like it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a bit of a journey in it, then it's probably a really good idea. That has always been my experience. I mean, the things that have turned out well have been good from the very beginning. They have sounded like good ideas from the first 2 or 3 paragraph thing that I wrote. And it's also, you do need to have scripts and things. I mean, are you studying screenwriting?
I was a screenwriting student.
I mean, when you go looking for jobs, you will have to have scripts to show people that you know how to write a script. But the people in film and telly do not have the time to read full-length scripts. They're not going to read them. No. What they want is your ideas. Then they want to read. If they like you, they'll want to read your script. But you have to develop that skill. It's so important.
Hugh's next play, the intriguingly titled High-Spec Luxury Lifestyle Block 94A, airs on BBC Radio 4 in October.